We're going to go ahead and get started with our next presenter here, who's going to talk a little bit about Innersource, which is an interesting thing that I knew about in concept, but I'd never actually heard a term put to it until I was assigned this particular paper as one of his reviewers. And so it was interesting to see this concept develop and talk about his experience implementing it in his organization. So our presenter is James Knowlton. He is a QA architect for NAVEX Global, has about 25 years experience in the industry. This is his second time presenting at PNSQC. In his organization, he's responsible for the technical leadership for the software testing across the entire company. And so today he's going to share a little bit about their adventure into Innersource and how they've implemented that at NAVEX. And so with that, I'll turn it over to James.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. Hey everybody, it's good to be here. I'm Jim, or James, probably usually Jim, but I'm happy to visit with you about this interesting topic. Just a little bit more about me. I've done, and I think this is relevant to sort of the project that we worked on. I started in software testing in 1992, testing WordPerfect Office for DOS. So that tells you that I've seen a lot of different and weird projects over the years. And so I think that experience kind of helped me in this particular situation that we found ourselves. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So basically, what we're going to talk about in this presentation, it's essentially a case study, and so I would love to hear. I'm pretty ADD, so if you feel you have a question in the middle of my presentation, don't worry about it at all. I won't melt down and not be able to continue. So I would love to hear any comments you have all the way through, and of course, there will be time at the end also for comments. But basically, what we're going to talk about is how we used open source principles at NAVEX to sort of collaboratively build an automation framework to support all of the different engineering teams that we have. And we're going to talk about NAVEX, what the company is, what they do, sort of the organization. We're going to talk about the challenge that we faced as I was hired there, and then also sort of how we decided to address it. First, a little bit about NAVEX Global. They are a provider of hosted software solutions, cloud-based ethics and compliance software. They offer hotline reporting, case management, policy compliance software, vendor management software, online compliance training, and other tools. Their headquarters are actually in Lake Oswego, Oregon, but they also have offices in the U.S., several offices in the U.S., such as Rexburg, Idaho, Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia, and also a sales office in London, England. And we have about 900 employees, so just to give you kind of an idea size-wise of the size of the company. NAVEX was built through acquisitions. So basically, what happened was in July of 2012, a venture capital company, a local venture capital company called Riverside, created NAVEX Global by buying a company called Ethics Point, which was in Lake Oswego. And also they acquired a company called Policy Tech, and they also bought a company called Global Compliance in Charlotte, North Carolina. They combined all of those companies into a single company and called it NAVEX Global. And so from the very beginning, NAVEX was really a company of different engineering teams and different cultures and different sort of ways of doing things. In October 2014, they were bought by a larger venture capital company called Vista Equity Partners, and they acquired NAVEX. In August of last year, we acquired a company called The Network. And to give you an idea, at that time, NAVEX was about 500 employees. The Network was about 500 employees, so they doubled basically the size of the company. So right now there have been some attrition just because of the acquisition of The Network, so we have probably between 900 and 1,000 employees across the company. They also have said that they are are definitely an acquisitive company. They expect to be doing more acquisitions, both towards the end of this year and next year. So the pace of sort of growth through acquisition is not expected to slow down. So naturally, that can create some interesting engineering issues. So this kind of gives you a map of the company, of the sites and the products that they work on. So in Lake Oswego, Oregon, which is where the company headquarters are, we have a product called Ethics Point, which makes incident management. It's like case reporting. When I'm reporting bribery or sexual harassment or things like that inside a company, we basically provide third-party case management and reporting of those issues. They also have a gateway product that basically provides sort of a common interface for people if they have multiple products to be able to do single sign-on and other types of common functionality. In Rexburg, Idaho, we have a product called Policy Tech, which is policy management. Essentially, if you think of like at a hospital where they have policies and procedures and that they want to document and make sure that people have read and make sure people understand. That's kind of what Policy Tech does. They also have a product both in Charlotte, North Carolina and in Rexburg. The engineering is actually split there. It's a new product. It's called Risk Rate Vendor Management. Essentially, the idea behind this is, I'm a company, I'm going out and getting vendors. I want to make sure that the vendors don't have legal claims against them and stuff like that. So they basically are, they allow you to do research on potential vendors. One of the interesting things we have as you move over to Charlotte is we also have IntegraLink Incident Management, because IntegraLink was one of the products from Global Compliance that we bought. So essentially we have multiple incident management products. And although they certainly would love to be able to consolidate those into a single product and end of life the other ones, it's not as simple as that, because some of the products have certain features that the others don't, and there's difficulty there. So they also have Risk Rate, and then in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where the network is, they have the GRC Suite incident management product, and they also have a learning management product. And so, as you can see, we have a lot of different sites, a lot of different products. We bought a lot of different companies. It creates a very sort of, mixed environment, to say the least, from an engineering standpoint. So, talking about the NAVEX QA environment, as far as the team structure, prior to my arrival, I was hired as a QA architect, and there wasn't one before I was there, in May of 2015. And they instituted Scrum about a year before that, I believe, and Agile development. So the way they are structured is each engineering team, each engineering team has what they call a technology owner, which is usually an engineering manager or a project manager, who is basically responsible for delivery of that product, everything that that entails that, including development, including QA, including business analysis, including design, all of it. So they are essentially responsible for delivery of that product, and they manage the QA people, and they manage the developers, and they manage all of them. And we also have DevOps in some of the teams, not all of the teams, but some of the teams have DevOps as well. And as you can expect, because of the way that I laid out sort of how the company is organized, when I got there was significant difference in skill levels, in tools used, in automation, frameworks. Some of the teams were very involved in automation and had people with skills. Some of the teams did basically no automation at all and were 100% manual testing and didn't really have people with the expertise to be able to do automation, at least not on their own. And so, there was just a lot of disjointedness among the different teams, which was one of the reasons I was hired. So if we go in here, so basically the automation challenge itself was there was a pre-existing framework. The framework was built by, and this was stuff that happened before I got there. So this is sort of me from talking to people that were there. It was built by a single person based on Ruby and Water, which I love Ruby and Water, but nobody else really knew it or used it in the company. And it was built by a single guy, and he essentially owned the framework. So if you had problems with the framework, if you wanted to be able to do something new, you emailed him, and he made the changes, and then he sent you a new version of it. And obviously, this created a huge bottleneck and a lot of problems. The framework was highly customized. What they were trying to do was create something that was sort of keyword-based, where people that were not necessarily programmers or not necessarily automation people could just easily build automation without really having to write code. But as usually happens when you try to customize something too much, it becomes very brittle, very difficult to maintain, and that's what happened here. And there was really not a lot of publicly available training because, of course, it was a highly customized framework. So it wasn't like you could just go out, and go to a website and read about how to use it. So that made it much more difficult too. Going back to the geographical distance, the fact that there was a lot of difference in expertise and knowledge in the different teams made training on the framework extremely difficult, which is why some of the teams had basically just given up on automation. And some of the teams had done it themselves because they happened to have the expertise in team. But there was a lot of sort of disjointedness there. And then, of course, the one person who did develop it quit. So, which usually happens in these cases. So then they really were kind of up a creek. And so it was kind of a mess. So that was sort of the issue that I was hired. I mean, in addition to other things, that was one of the main issues that I was hired to sort of try to address. In short, we had a QA organization that was dispersed all over the company, which makes training definitely more of a challenge. They had significant variation in the level of QA and coding experience. They had management sometimes that was willing but not able to provide experienced technical direction. So in other words, some of the managers were technical people, but not all of them were. And some of them, didn't really understand automation and were certainly willing to support it, but didn't really even know what was needed. We had a framework that was in a language not really used widely at the company. We were a .NET shop, almost, we were probably 90% .NET and about 10% Java and 0% Ruby as far as development skills. And so there really wasn't any help that developers could provide the QA people in terms of the automation framework. And so as a consequence, the automation wasn't even really looked at by developers because they didn't really know it. They didn't have any investment in it. And also, it also made them, because it was brittle, trust it less as well. So it wasn't really understood enough to change or improve. And so as a result, it basically had a lot of these kind of problems. And so we looked at different, when I was hired, one of the things I looked at was, I said, okay, how can we sort of resolve this issue? And one of the things that I felt right away was, we can't have one person doing it, because that's just a prescription for disaster. And when I was interviewed for the job, I said the first thing I said was, I am not going to be the sort of the lord of the automation. It needs to be something that everyone feels an investment in and everyone feels responsible for, including developers. And so I did some research. I looked at, there was a talk that Denise Cooper from PayPal did at OSCON last year. And it talked about Innersource. And basically what Innersource is open source principles applied to internal projects. And the principles are basically that engineers share their work with a wide audience instead of just with a manager or team. Everyone can contribute to the project. Distributed version control is used. Just a sec here. Distributed version control is used, such as GitHub, so that collaboration and code review can happen more easily. New code repositories or branches can be made freely. People at large geographical distances at separate times can work on the same code or contribute different files of code to the same project. And communication tends to be written and posted to public sites instead of shared informally by word of mouth. And then it's applied internally at an organization, such that Innersource differs from classic open source by remaining within the view and control of a single organization. The openness of the project extends across many teams within the organization. Ideally, code is shared freely within the entire organization. In other words, the ideal situation is one in which, on projects where it's at least possible from a security standpoint, you make it freely available to everyone. Anyone can download the code, anyone can build it, anyone can contribute through pull requests. Essentially, everyone is able to be a contributor to the project. And so everyone feels like an owner. And that includes developers. And sometimes it requires developers to do that. I mean, one of the advantages of building something, and I'll get into this later, but one of the reasons that we actually built our framework in .NET and using Selenium was so that we could get developer support and developers would be bought in and they would be invested. So Denise Cooper of PayPal defines it as the application of best practices, processes, culture, and methodologies taken from the open source world and applied to internal software development and innovation efforts. So in other words, it consists of using the benefits of open source in the context of an organization's internal projects, as we talked about. And we talked about that. So some of the benefits of Innersource are that there's a sense of ownership for the whole team. The code reuse grows immensely. The cross-team collaboration is much improved. One of the issues that we had also just as an organization when I first got there was that because the company had been built through acquisition and because they were geographically disparate, there were QA people that basically didn't even know who each other were and never talked to each other. And this was a project that would enable everyone to basically be on the same virtual team. And so, you could code review someone, if you were in the policy tech team, you could code review automation code for this framework, this common framework that someone on the, on the risk rate team had built. And so it was an opportunity for everyone to collaborate. So our solution to this was what we call the ANOVA Framework. So the ANOVA Framework was basically a test automation framework for UI-based testing of web applications. So it's based on Selenium, and it uses .NET, just because most of the company uses .NET. And we make use of the page object model, which is a Selenium design pattern designed to encourage code maintainability. It was initially developed by some of the teams here in Lake Oswego with a partnership between developers and QA people. And from the very beginning, they were both involved heavily in it, and they both owned it. It was not seen as a QA effort. It was really just seen as a test effort. And I think that was key to its success. So after I was brought in as QA architect, one of the big things that I did was to sort of develop and improve the process, so that, because they had kind of organically built it, but there was really no sense of releases, there was no sense of sort of a regular cadence to how things were being done. And so that was one of the things that we did, was sort of build an organization and a process structure around what was already being done. So talking about the ANOVA architecture, there's basically 3 levels of automation architecture. So the first level on the bottom, we have the ANOVA framework itself, which it's owned by the entire engineering organization. It contains common objects and helper methods, and it is completely product independent. In other words, you don't have to have any NAVEX product installed to install and run the ANOVA framework. And we actually have a test app that we built that we have tests that test ANOVA, so that every time we do a check-in, we run our ANOVA automated tests against it to verify all the functions and everything else works as it should work, independently of any product. And one of the things I should mention here is that one of the design principles that we pushed from the very beginning was that it should be very lightweight. You know, we didn't want it to try to be everything to everyone. We didn't want it to do everything that you could possibly need to do in a test framework. We wanted it to sort of, in the Unix philosophy, to do a few things and do them really well. And then the next level up is the product framework. So this would be owned by individual product teams. They could put anything they wanted into this. So if there was a function or a helper or some other piece of code that would help them in testing their product, but it didn't really fit to try to put it into ANOVA, they could put it into their product framework. Also, additionally, if you had a test developer inside a product team that built something really cool that they thought could apply to ANOVA, then it could get promoted from their product framework into the ANOVA framework. And they would branch, submit it, do a pull request, and it would get code reviewed. And if it was approved, then it would get pulled into the ANOVA framework. And then, of course, on top of that is the tests. So this was kind of the basic architectural structure that we had. So let's see. So as far as the organization, the team organization, the way that it worked is we had, I was the architect. Essentially, my job was to provide overall direction and leadership, and I was the chair of the ANOVA steering committee, which we'll get to in a minute. And then the steering committee was comprised of 3 or 4 people with representatives from Dev and QA, and multiple different products and different sites. So one of the things that we didn't want was, because the headquarters are in Lake Oswego of the company, and the biggest product is in Lake Oswego, which is Ethics Point or EPIM, there sometimes in some initiatives tended to be a Lake Oswego-ification of projects. And for the other sites to sort of feel left out a little bit. And I wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So from the very beginning, we made sure that there were representatives from all the sites. There were Dev and QA people in this steering committee. And basically, the purpose of the steering committee was to plan and direct ANOVA releases, to groom the backlog, and to communicate with engineers on any ANOVA tasks assigned. So, and we'll get into sort of how the sprints and releases work in a minute. But basically, the steering committee's job was to steer ANOVA. So, to provide sort of general guidance on how we would do things. Their job really was to groom the backlog, make sure that things were prioritized correctly, et cetera. And then, of course, the engineering cross-platform, cross-product team is pretty much the entire engineering organization. And anybody could contribute to ANOVA. Anybody could contribute either ideas, put stories into the backlog, or could write code, sign up for tasks, do pretty much anything that they had interest in doing. So here's the ANOVA schedule. So every 6 weeks, and this has actually changed a little bit. even though it says every 6 weeks here, we did that for a while. We've actually pushed the releases to quarterly just because we're not doing as much stuff now on NOVA as we were probably 6 months ago. But just for the purposes of this slide, as an example, we would do the releases every 6 weeks. We would do them in sync with the product release cycle, and they would be comprised of 2 3-week sprints. So now what we do is we do quarterly releases, and they're comprised of 3 1-month sprints. But it's, I mean, that's kind of adjustable just depending on your needs. As far as sprint planning, first of all, everyone interested is invited. There's absolutely no one who would not be invited to the sprint planning meeting for NOVA. And we basically do we call it sprint planning, and it's sort of agile-ish, but it's not really strictly agile. And I'll get to why that is in a minute. But everyone interested is invited. We complete the current sprint, which consists of reviewing the stories that are supposed to be done for the sprint we're completing, and moving stories if they need to be moved to the next sprint, closing stories that can be closed, having people show the work that they've done. We plan the upcoming sprint, which consists of looking at any stories that have been moved to the new sprint and also reviewing the backlog. And essentially, the way that the sprint planning works is we don't do, story points, estimates, all of that stuff. We don't do any of that stuff. We basically just, because the framework basically works now, and this is not a product we're trying to release to the public, and because everyone who's contributing also has other products they're working on. Essentially, the way we do it is we look at the backlog, we say, okay, this is the top item in the backlog. Is there someone that would like to work on this? And someone says, yeah, I'd like to work on that. So we assign it to that person. After sprint planning, they will clone that story into their project's sprint so that their team knows that they're working on that thing, so they can allocate their time within their own team. And that's basically all we do. And then, when we get to the end of the sprint, we remind people about halfway through the sprint, hey, you signed up for this, make sure it's updated. Let me know if you run into any issues. And then when we get to the end of the sprint, we either close the stories because they're completed, or if somebody says, hey, this other thing came up on my product, I didn't have time to work on this, we say, okay, and we just move it to the next sprint. No big deal. And so that's what I mean when I say it's low maintenance. As far as grooming the backlog, the steering committee does that. We usually do it weekly. We just take a look at the backlog, make sure that there aren't any more stories that need to be added, and anyone can add stories to the backlog also. If you're an engineer on a team, you just think, wow, this would be a really cool idea, add a story to the backlog, and we'll take a look at it. So it doesn't mean someone else will work on it, but we'll at least take a look at it and see if it's worth considering for the next sprint. So as far as NOVA training and documentation, so we've done a lot of documentation, and we use Confluence at NAVEX, and we've built a very extensive documentation system for the ANOVA Framework, and we've done that through, people have signed up for stories to document things. So that's been part of our project, is people signing up for stories to write documents on how to do different things. And the API documentation that we have is automatically generated via Doxygen with every build. So all of our test methods, not test methods, but all of our methods, our classes, everything else, we have pretty good documentation in it so that someone can actually have API documentation if they're trying to build tests and see what all methods are available in NOVA and what they can do with it. Like I said, we decided to implement it in C# because we have a ton of development experience on C#, so it really has helped, having resources available in terms of architecture and engineering of the framework. And so some of the benefits that we have seen from NOVA are I guess the only other thing I wanted to mention is we use Slack for communication, and so we have a Slack channel, a NOVA Slack channel that everyone subscribes to and everyone looks at, and it's been awesome, especially for people that are learning NOVA, who are not local. They can post a question, everyone monitors it, they can get questions answered pretty quickly, and they feel like even if they're remote and there isn't necessarily anybody at their site that knows NOVA, they have people that can answer their questions quickly and easily. So some of the benefits are collective code ownership, using a standard framework and design pattern, Selenium and the page object, allowed us to more easily build and collaborate across the organization. Also, we use Pluralsight for training videos, and we were able to easily build. I built basically a curriculum for new QA engineers that said, okay, when you start, these are the things by the first 2 weeks these videos you need to have gone through, these training things you need to have gone through, and we'll work with you and we'll kind of check up on you, and but that kind of gives them a ramp up or a boot camp easily to be able to really get a head start on learning the documentation. So this also, like I said, this also made training a lot easier because there's a ton of publicly available sources. Some of the lessons learned were that we found constant collaboration to be critical. And so, like I said, we use Slack, and it's really helped us a lot. As each team was different in its ability to jump into implementing NOVA, we've been very flexible in terms of implementation schedule. So one of the things also about NOVA that we made a decision was that we weren't going to impose it on any teams. We were looking at it as a resource rather than a requirement. We were saying, this is this thing we're building, this is available, we can all contribute to it, we can all be part of it, but we're not going to tell you must be on NOVA by 10/1. Because teams have products to get out, and they have different reasons for making the decisions that they do, and I didn't think that would be productive. So, and most of the teams have seen the value in it and have voluntarily wanted to be involved and been very excited about it. So I talked about the framework being lightweight. So that's pretty much my presentation on what we did. This is some of my contact information if you're curious or you have more questions later. But other than that, does anybody have any questions? Yeah?
So you're using Selenium using the web page, so none of the applications are a desktop application where you need to do other types of testing?
We have, most of the applications are web because it's like a SaaS. We're a hosted software company. There are some desktop plugins like Word modules for policy tech and other things. There are some places where Selenium hasn't necessarily been able to be used for automation. And in those cases, either the team has done something else for automation or they've just manually verified those parts. One of the things is that we don't want to, it's sort of an 80-20 rule, We don't want to necessarily market NOVA and say, we can do all your testing with this and you won't need to use anything else. I think it's a way to cover probably 80% of the type of user level testing we would need to do. Yeah?
Question is sort of two-part. One is what encourages your product teams to, or what motivates them to promote it to the framework level? And two, if it is going to be, if your entire test framework is going to be in a single repo, how many of your vertical products have actually been able to migrate to this repo?
So the first question is, I think the product teams have been motivated because They really saw the value in, they had QA people that really wanted to be able to contribute to a framework and weren't able to before. And so I think basically one of the first things I did after I was hired is I flew out to Rexburg and I flew out to Charlotte and I sort of sold it to people. And I said, you know, we're doing this new thing. We're going to open up the source code. You'll be able to contribute to it. We'll provide training. You'll be able to be part of it. And people were excited. I mean, they were on board. You know, and as far as the second part, as far as repos, basically the way that we're structured is that we have NOVA is its own repo, independent of any product, and then the individual teams have their automation, you know, set up the way that they choose to do it. Like, for instance, with EPIM or Ethics Point and Gateway, those products use a lot of common things. So they actually decided, especially since they're both at the same site, they decided to just have one repo for all of their tests, and they just have different folders for like Gateway and EPIM because they have a lot of common stuff that they have to access. The other teams have done it in different ways, but I haven't really like said you need to do it this way. Any other questions? Yeah.
Since you followed the Innersource pattern, did you ever encounter any of the open source kind of issues you might find out that they replicate something like people like fork stuff or have a fancy one for?
I think it hasn't been a problem because our team is pretty small. So, you know, and it's because the product is pretty small and lightweight, it hasn't been an issue. I could see where it might be an issue in some situations, but it hasn't been for us. Any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned you tested your framework, but not within a product context. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, sure. So basically what we did was we built because for a while we had the framework, but we were testing it with EPIM just because it was built in Lake Oswego initially. And I remember going to the team and I said, well, that's not going to work going forward because one, other teams aren't necessarily going to have EPIM installed, and two, if you have a bug with EPIM, you know, how will you know if it's a NOVA problem or an EPIM problem? So what we did was we just built a test web app, you know, that just goes to pages and clicks on buttons and has a frame and, you know, just very basic sort of web elements. And essentially it just runs through all the different test methods, validating that they work. So the helper methods. Yeah.
Do you have tests that test the core framework?
Yeah, that's what I was just mentioning.
As in, like, common functions which are really not product specific? Is there like, so if somebody from company or product A is going to request to push some changes into your common framework,
Mm-hmm.
how do we ensure that it doesn't break any of the assumptions or?
We do a couple of things. I think the tests that we have to test the framework, that is essentially the contract. So that is our API. And the second thing is we use GitHub and we have pull requests. So anything that's going to get checked in to master gets a code review. So, you know, so far we haven't had any disasters. Yeah.
I gather that the contributors to this project also have competing responsibilities in your organization.
Yes.
So how do you reconcile that? They have more reason to you know than
So basically the way I reconcile it is that I take second place. You know, that's what I basically do is we have our sprint planning meeting and I make sure people know your product responsibilities are sort of numero uno. But the managers also know that because part of the way that this works is that I work for the CTO and all the technology owners also work for the CTO, and the CTO is very pro-Nova. And so essentially, yes, the product takes first place, but and this has never been an issue, but they can't use that to sort of not ever want to give their engineers time to work on Nova. So it's kind of like a compromise, I guess. Yeah?
So related to that, you were mentioning that you have backlog and then you kind of do a light sprint planning, but then you don't assign points. But then they have to take that story, clone it into their sprint. So they do have to do a story point into
Yeah.
that story.
Yeah, they probably have to do a sort of a rough estimate, at least for their product team,
But
yeah.
it's the responsibility of their team.
Yes.
at that point.
Yep. Yeah, that's how we've done it.
Abbreviation of NOVA, I don't know.
What's that?
I'm guessing the H stands for NAVEX.
Oh, no, I actually was just, when I first got there, it didn't have a name. And so I was like, well, we got to have some kind of a name. And so I actually was just looking up names on the internet, and I think there's a French word like nouveau that means new. And I thought, that sounds kind of cool. Let's call it Nova. So, and nobody objected, so. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.